into muscles that move the foot and toes. And we have a couple examples on this slide showing you different muscles that move the foot and toes, and I'm combining these together. There's very little in the intrinsic foot that we're going to focus on. We'll see some detail, some internal anatomy detail, but in some of these examples you can see the internal detail shown superficially. This is Robert Forstermann on the right hand side, is a German track cyclist with probably the largest legs I've ever seen. Pretty phenomenal. Even on the left, it's a pretty good example. Muscles that move the foot and toes, like with the upper limb, those muscles originate proximal to the appendage, proximal to the digits, proximal to the wrist or the ankle. The muscles that move the toes originate closer to the core, so on the forearm or on the lower leg. And the muscles that we're going to look at that do that in the lower limb are listed here. There are many more muscles than this in the lower limb. But we are only focusing on flexors and extensors. Some in the anterior compartment, some in the posterior compartment. And flexors and extensors aren't the right way or the easiest way to discriminate these muscles, to separate them. We name them instead for their action on the ankle. In flexion and extension of the ankle, it's hard to tell where the joint angle opens or closes depending on which side you observe or measure. So instead, we call them plantar flexors and dorsiflexors, named for the surfaces of the foot. The underside is the plantar surface. So a plantar flexor points the toe, and a dorsiflexor, the back or the top of the foot, flexes the foot upwards, brings the back of the foot, the toes, closer to the lower limb. And I can't remember why I had, oh yeah, main functional group are flexors. They both flex, just in different directions. So the plantar flexors, being in the posterior compartment, pointing the toe, plantar flexor, innervated all by the tibial nerve, just like in the leg proper, the thigh, the muscles that we saw flex the knee. Those were all tibial nerve innervated muscles as well. The major muscles on the back, the calves, so to speak, well, the calves are really the gastrocnemius, most superficially, the soleus just beneath that. And I'm also going to show you the flexor digitorum longus, which parallels the muscles that we looked at in the upper limb and is an example of the muscles that will flex the toes distally. The gastroc and the soleus don't flex the toes. They only flex or plantar flex the ankle. On the anterior side, the dorsiflexors, and that's a little incompatible. Anterior side, dorsiflexors. So keep that straight. In the anterior compartment of the thigh, we saw muscles innervated by the femoral nerve. Here, our naming scheme falls apart. The femoral nerve does not carry down into the lower leg. So muscles on the anterior side that dorsiflex are innervated by the fibular nerve, or the common fibular nerve, or sometimes also known as the peroneal nerve. The ones that I have listed here, Tibialis Anterior, is probably the signature muscle on the anterior side, the one just beside your shin bone, and the extensor digitorum longus to complement the flexor in the posterior compartment. These are technically innervated by the deep fibular nerve, and I'll show you why that's important in a second. These are the muscles that are implicated in foot drop. Remember way back when we talked about how the fibula might break and damage a nerve, and sometimes improper yoga and flexing can damage a nerve, or impact to the side of the leg damages a nerve. This is where that culminates. And the nerve that gets damaged, I'll show you shortly, innervates both of these muscles, being both on the front of the foot that keep the foot elevated. If they're damaged, they can't keep the foot elevated. And so the foot falls. And it's a big problem when you're walking normally and you try to take a step and you normally lift your toes, but you can't do that. Instead, your toe drags across the ground and foot drop. That is the clinical name, or the common name. It's probably not the clinical name. So let's take a look at these. Gastroc, Soleus, FDL, Tib Ant, EDL, and some of the nerves. FDL and EDL are obviously short forms. When we, in the research, when we're looking at responses in different types of muscle, you'll learn about this next section, fast muscle and slow twitch muscle. We use rats a lot for those experiments. And the Soleus and the EDL are two very different types of muscle. We just take it out of the rat and mince it all up and look for different characteristics. So I often just call it EDL or FDL. Let's start in the posterior compartment, the most superficial muscle, the gastrocnemius, two heads, medial and lateral. But overall, the gastrocnemius is both of those heads together. And it originates on the epicondyles of the femur, the medial and lateral epicondyles of the femur. Now, if I get rid of some of these up here, you can see that. See the epicondyles of the femur, the origin of the medial head, and the lateral head is sandwiched in behind there. These converge at what's technically called the gastrocnemius tendon. Here it's listed as the calcaneal tendon, which is true. The gastrocnemius tendon becomes the calcaneal tendon. And this inserts, if you were to guess, on the calcaneus, the heel bone, all the way down here at the bottom of the foot. Calcaneal bone, the calcaneus. This is your Achilles tendon, commonly known as the Achilles tendon. This is the common insertion point for the gastroc, which we're looking at now, and the soleus that we'll look at in a second. And you can see, highlighted in blue here, the tibial nerve running right down the middle of the back of the leg. Tibial nerve, all the muscles in the posterior compartment. It holds out in the lower leg. Both the medial and the lateral heads of the gastrocnemius innervated by the tibial nerve. And this is the largest muscle in the lower leg. It's powerful. Very powerful muscle. Lots of force generated here. But let's get rid of it. It's not the workhorse. It's powerful when you lift a lot of weight doing calf raises. It's usually the gastroc. But the workhorse is the soleus muscle. This is a more aerobic muscle. It can do a lot of work over a long period of time. Not as much force as the gastroc, but this is the workhorse. That's really active in walking, normal walking. Long periods of walking, long periods of running. The soleus is the major muscle involved in toe off, in those kinds of activities. And so you can see its origin on the back of the fibula. Look laterally, the back of the fibula. On the tibia, it's not so clear, so I'm going to show you what it looks like. We have the back of the fibula as the first origin point. And the soleus spreads all the way across the back of the tibia, originating from what we call the soleal line. Soleus originating from the soleal line. And I only bring this up because it's also important for the Flexor Digitorum Longus coming up shortly. So pretty wide origin. which is good. Pretty wide origin that also inserts into the calcaneal tendon, which I've removed when I took gastroc off. So both of these will act to plantar flex the foot. Soleus only plantar flexes the foot. Gastrocnemius, because it originates on the femur, will also flex the knee. Secondary action. Primary action in both cases, plantar flexing the foot. If we dive a little deeper, this is what we're looking at. Flexor digitorum longus. I said there were a lot of muscles in the lower leg, and that's true. We're not looking at all of them. But flexor digitorum longus, also originating from just below the soleal line, looks very similar to what we just saw for the soleus, just underneath it, and running along the medial belly of the soleus. It loops all the way under the medial malleolus of the tibia and inserts all the way on the distal phalanges. See the yellow tendons highlighted at the bottom? All the way at the distal phalanges. From the tibia, around the medial malleolus to the distal phalanges. And so it also has two actions. One, it's going to plantar flex the foot, but that's not its main action. You sit there and make fists with your toes. That's the action of flexor digitorum longus, curling the toes inwards underneath the foot. Like in Die Hard, when you land safely, go to your hotel, take your shoes off, socks off, make fists with your toes. That's still a cult classic, right? I'm not dating myself by referencing Die Hard. So those are the muscles that we want to look at in the posterior compartment. Only 3. Notice there's a separate muscle for the big toe on the flexor and the extensor side, but we're not going to really look at that right now. Very similar path, somewhat different origin, similar actions as the FDL shown here. Now, while we're on the posterior portion of the leg, I want to draw your attention to an area of interest. Like the femoral triangle, there's an area of interest on the back of the leg. And that area of interest is this area here, called the Popliteal Fossa. Popliteal Fossa, or the knee pit, like the armpit, but for your knee. Popliteal Fossa. And what makes this area special? Well, first of all, what is this area? Diamond-shaped, bordered superficially or superiorly by semimembranosus on the inside. The long head of biceps femoris on the lateral side, the top 2 parts of the diamond. And then inferiorly by the muscles of the gastrocnemius. Let's ignore this little guy for now, plantaris. We don't really care about it. Let's ignore it for now. The lateral and medial borders on the inferior aspect of the popliteal fossa are the heads of the gastrocnemius. So what do we see in this area? Well, obviously, there's a nerve running through here, which is the tibial nerve, right down the middle. Easy to define. Right down the middle of the popliteal fossa. But that's not the only nerve. And this is going to be important as we look towards the front of the leg. On the lateral side is the fibular nerve. Here, the common fibular nerve. It splits later. That's why we call it common. This is always on the lateral superior border. Always running down the inside of the biceps femoris. So I show you a popliteal fossa diagram on an exam and ask you, what's this nerve? You're going to know what it is, right? Always arranged like this. Thank you for the yes. What else is of interest in the popliteal fossa? Like in the the femoral triangle, not only nerves but also arteries and veins. This is the point where the femoral artery becomes the popliteal artery. There are two branches that come off that I'm not showing you, but the name of the artery changes. The femoral artery becomes the popliteal artery. And on the venous side, which is always the third item in the list, the thing furthest from our mind, in close relationship with the artery is the popliteal vein. Only the popliteal vein. These are the important structures of the popliteal fossa, this diamond shape shown here. So if I asked you with a blank diagram, label all of these things, and there were 4 letters, A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, and they pointed at the artery, vein, and both nerves. You could do it. Done. So an area of interest where neat things happen. Let's turn our attention now to the anterior compartment, and we're going to follow this common fibular nerve around. And I'm just going to get rid of some of the stuff in the way as we turn our attention to the muscles on the anterior compartment that we are interested in. First of all, the Tibialis Anterior, Tibant, and the extensor Digitorum Longus. I took one in the lateral compartment out. That's not a major focus for us right now. Now both of these buck convention. They don't follow the anterior compartment convention. It was femoral nerve, not now. Fibular nerve. Deep branch of the fibular nerve, but if you said fibular nerve, you're fine. Let's take a look at where these head, where these go, the origin of Tibialis Anterior. This long swath of the superior aspect, superior and lateral aspect of the tibia, the first half of the superior and lateral aspect of the tibia, all the way along the inside of the shin, that ridge that originates from the tibial tuberosity. And let's just say that it inserts at the base of the first metatarsal. We're not looking at the tarsals specifically. You don't have to remember all of the tarsals, but you know that there are 7. There are 5 metatarsals. And we're going to say that it inserts on the base of the first metatarsal in this 3-toed example. You can see it better shown here. Wrapping around the inside of the foot and the insertion just on the base of the first metatarsal. So this is going to dorsiflex the foot, primary action, and let's leave it at that. That's the primary and the only action. There's a secondary action, but we're not going to go into depth. I don't want to confuse you. And then to contrast, the flexor digitorum longus on the back, the extensor digitorum longus, also innervated by the fibular nerve, inserts again at the base of the distal phalanges, but on the superior aspect, on the top surface of the base of the distal phalanges. So when you try to extend your toes upwards, that's the action of extensor digitorum longus. Now I want to point out these muscles both dorsiflex, keep the foot raised, keep the toe raised so you don't trip on it while you're walking. And while I'm telling you that they're innervated by the fibular nerve, technically it's the deep branch. And you can see that highlighted here. So the common fibular that runs down the inside of the popliteal fossa splits. And you're looking at that split right now. The common fibular splits into deep fibular and superficial fibular nerves. Or deep peroneal, it's another name for it, and superficial peroneal nerves. And look at where they are in relation to the fibula, one of the weakest bones in the body, most susceptible to impact and breakage. And if the neck of the fibula breaks, what's a sensitive structure right there in close proximity? This nerve. If the common fibular or the deep fibular branch are damaged, both of these muscles in the anterior compartment won't be functional. If it's completely severed, they won't be functional. If it's somewhat damaged, you can't contract them forcefully. But if there's damage, they don't work as well. So foot drops. And maybe we'll leave it there. Did that description make sense? You can tell me the contents of the popliteal fossa, you know, the innervation of the anterior and posterior compartments. The origins and insertions are similar and complementary on both sides. Any questions or clarifications before we call it? Do you have questions? No? No, it's fine. Maybe you're asking your friends questions. All right, let's summarize then. Lower limb. Pelvis and lower limb. These slides are already, they're only named pelvis, which is really a misnomer. Pelvis and lower limb. Way back when, a week and a half ago, we introduced the pelvic girdle, which are the two coxal bones plus the sacrum and the coccyx. 5 fused vertebrae in the sacrum, 4 in the coccyx, 3 fused bones in each coxal bone. Ilium, ischium, pubis. You know their orientations well, you know their main structures. The ala, the wing, being one of the main components of the ilium, etc. Ischial tuberosity, sit bones. We won't go through them in depth. Those make the pelvic girdle. They articulate at the front of the pubic symphysis. And they hold the articulation point of the lower leg, that being the acetabulum, the deep socket that allows for a fair bit of stability and a wide range of motion for the femur at the acetabulum. Also anchored by that ligament at the head of the femur and the fovea that has some arterial and nervous supply, which I don't think we got into in depth, but that's okay. But we know the femur. You know it's the largest bone in the body. You know its main characteristics. The trochanters are limited to the femur, are only apparent on the femur. And like the upper limb, 30 bones. But in 4 locations, not 3. And the only difference is that we consider the patella a separate location. The patella is where one of the extra locations come into play. And we have 7 instead of 8 tarsals 7 tarsals instead of 8 carpals. So same total number of bones in slightly more numerous locations, and you can name most of them. If you describe the classes of them, you can name them all. But you don't need to know the names of the tarsals themselves. And we went in depth Friday and today, and even I think a little bit on Thursday last week, origin, insertion, and innervation of these muscles. Little blood supply, little drainage, and that's fine. We're focused on their actions and placements primarily. And I tried to cherry pick muscles that held to these naming conventions. Tibial nerve posteriorly, maybe the femoral nerve anteriorly, or the fibular nerve if you've taken into consideration the muscles we talked about today. Like I said, long class.